So, gentlemen, right now it is very interesting, and I'm not sure if you knew this. Right now, 130 countries around the world are exploring implementing or assessing central bank digital currencies, which basically represents 98% of the global GDP. And just in May, a few years ago, it was only 35. So from 35 to 130, it's a massive jump. And like there's 64 countries who are really in advanced phases trying to see if a central bank digital currency can work in their country. Now, before we jump into this, let's define what it is. In its easiest form, a central bank digital currency is just virtual money backed and issued by a central bank. So it would be the dollar, but just digitally. And a lot of politicians argue that it is something that will be much more efficient, much faster. It will be better. We don't need cash anymore. That's like dirty. And it will also help with credit cards, which, by the way, is an innovation from 1950s. So we haven't seen much innovation there whatsoever. So is it time for innovation? I think you all see CBDCs a little bit more critically and more problematically. So tell us why. Maybe we start with you, Stefan.
Sure. So ultimately, central bank digital currencies will bring the money database directly under the control of the government, as opposed to today where it is more resting, there's a central bank, but there's also a lot of commercial banks and retail banks out there. Now, obviously, for those of us from a libertarian perspective, we're skeptical of central bank digital currencies because of the privacy aspects and also, I would argue, the scarcity aspect. Because if we are operating in a central bank digital currency environment, the government still controls the money supply. And that is why Bitcoin is such an important contrast here, because it has an actually fixed supply. And so I think as long as you are using the money of your enemies, that you will be their slave, right? You will be, unfortunately, forced to fund their various operations. And if we want to make the size of the state smaller, it's going to require us to use non-state money.
Peter.
Yeah, so every alleged cost and convenience benefit from a CBDC can come from private stablecoins, which already exist. It's a vibrant market. Those already exist. And so the only excuse for a CBDC is surveillance and control, right? Those are the reasons why 98% of the governments of the world are currently trying to trial these things, is that is their bread and butter, right? So surveillance allows them to tax anything. Control allows them to control your life. CBDC makes that push button, right? So they can force you into any transaction they want. They can stop you from any transaction. If you take what happened with the Canadian truckers a couple of years ago, so imagine if, Justin Trudeau cut those truckers off from the banking system. Now imagine if instead of that, he could actually cut them off from all money usage. Okay, they could literally starve those truckers to death, which is what he tried to do. He simply didn't have control of the money. This is an absolute catastrophe. It expands the banking totalitarian panopticon into every last bit of money. And that's exactly what they're going to use, is the cost savings and the convenience. They're going to sell that to try to wipe out independent cash and turn it into, as Stefan said, a giant database that they can sit there and just move all the pieces around like a chessboard, reward their friends, starve their enemies.
Very good.
Yeah, all the purported benefits that are mentioned there, these are all benefits of centralization, right? The fact that you can have faster settlement, et cetera, of course, you have one node to update, right? But the inherent trade-off to having one node, like centralization, comes with these inherent risks. And when you compare that to Bitcoin, right, which is totally decentralized, you have to update all the nodes, but that is a very trust-minimized environment. When you have one node, you have to totally trust the issuer. And as we've been talking about, and as we've seen the past few years, trusting a centralized power is probably the worst strategy you can have in life. And the other thing is about CBDC specifically is that they undermine the principle of private property almost in its entirety. Obviously, they remove privacy, right? This is a single node database. It can be totally surveyed. And I would argue, too, that it undermines property even more so than just fiat currency, because not only can it be printed ad infinitum, but now there's one group that can press a button, basically, to freeze your funds, reverse your funds, seize your funds. And I think this is a natural segue into a Chinese social credit score style system, where they're just, it's overt social engineering, basically. And so, seeing the importance of private property, which is the basis of civilization, the unifying principle of civilization, I think CBDCs are decivilizing. They're destructive to human civilization itself. You could think of them as like fiat currency on steroids, and it's a terrible, terrible idea. And just to hammer home the importance of private property, I would like to quote Rand and Mises. Rand, who said, "The right to life is the source of all rights, and the right to property is their only implementation. Without private property rights, no other human rights are possible. Since man has to sustain his life by his own effort, the man who cannot control the product of his own effort has no means to sustain his life." So in a CBDC-style environment, we're talking about jeopardizing individuals' capacity to support their own livelihood. Very serious. And then Mises said that if history could teach us anything, it's that civilization and private property are inextricably linked. So if you get CBDCs that are printed ad infinitum, surveyed, controlled, ushering us into a Chinese social credit scoring type situation, I think it's just an Orwellian nightmare in front of us. So what's the answer? Hold your savings in Bitcoin and educate people about this problem.
Very good. And you already, Peter, evoked the Canadian truckers, but we don't have a CBDC yet. They're only talking about it, and I don't know how much attention really the public is paying to this, but what kind of privacy abuses have we seen already in the regulated financial world? Maybe we stay with you, Robert, and then go the other way around.
I actually thought of the Canadian truckers as well, but it wasn't just the truckers themselves. It was also contributors to this protest. And just I'm sure most people know about this, but this was a democratic, peaceful demonstration of people saying no to government intervention. And the most violent thing these protesters did was honk their horns. They had their bank accounts frozen. Contributors had their bank accounts frozen. I mean, this was in a country, this is Canada, right? It was considered to be one of the top 10 most liberal democracies in the world. It's asinine. So just to hammer that one example, but I think that one is enough, hopefully.
Yeah, and ever since it was really the Bank Secrecy Act kind of broke the dam on privacy, and that was around 1970. And that was allegedly, as it always was, it was to fight tax cheats and drug dealers and terrorists. So these are the standard go-tos. That and child predators, that's kind of the four horsemen behind everything government does, really. And of course, they took that and drove a truck through it. Now it has nothing to do with terrorists or drug dealers. Now they've got tens of thousands of so-called suspicious activity reports, SARs. Banks, if you move $10,000, the bank has to send a notification up to the government to tell them that this is possibly suspicious. It's absolutely insane. There's potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of these things generated. And each one is taken as probable cause for the government to go snoop around and see what you're up to. This is always what government does, right? They come in for a good cause. They come in with very, very limited scope. We're just going to use this for the terrorist drug dealers. And then here we are. So if we ever had that, right, if we expand that banking panopticon to every last dollar, it would be terrifying. It would convert fiat currency from thievery into enslavement.
I'll make a couple examples here in relation to the question of financial privacy. So Americans are probably familiar with, I believe it was 2017, Equifax had a big leak. 147 million people had their data leaked, and this is name, address, and various other pieces of information, and social security numbers leaked out there. So let's consider the risk as well of centralizing all this data in a forced, coerced way, and having all of your personal or private information, and individuals are getting doxed out here, left, right, and center. And that's just one example. There's another example, arguably even worse. So in India, and I believe this is in 2018, the system is known as the Aadhaar system. 1.1 billion Indians had their information leaked. And this information was apparently being traded around on WhatsApp chat groups for $7.
Billion.
Yeah, 1.1 billion people
Wow.
had their private information doxed and leaked because of inaccurate, improper security relating to an API. We're not going to get into the technical details, but the point is, they centralized, they created this honeypot, it was a KYC, AML reasons basis for it, but then this information, once you create this honeypot, guess what? Now hackers what they want to target that. And so in the same thing, if people want to find out what's Wolf's CBDC balance, what's Peter's CBDC balance, what did Robert spend his CBDCs on, guess what? That information is in a database somewhere. It can be used by your political opposition. And we've seen this in various countries around the world, where if you are saying something against the regime or against a tyrant even, they will put out bad press about you. They will try to leak whatever they can about you. So all they would need is one in to this centralized database, and then boom, now they know what you've been spending on. They could know what kind of health conditions you have based on what you're spending on. There's all these kinds of privacy ramifications when we're trapped into this fiat panopticon. And so I think that's why it's so important that people understand the threat and then also understand what is the solution. Now, I think it is also important to point out that a lot of these CBDCs are sort of at a pilot stage, and so it's going to be a few years off before most of them are really launched into practice. But there'll be a reality sooner or later, and that's going to also drive the conversation around what are the alternatives.
Yeah, I was going to add real quickly that the honeypot issue is massive when it comes to a CBDC, specifically because the country of China has enormous resources and is very, very interested in wearing down the US economy whatever way it would take. And so a honeypot like that to a country like China would be worth $1 trillion to break. They'd be absolute idiots if they didn't have hundreds of thousands of hackers going after it. The government has been one of the worst custodians of security, of data. There are multiple examples from all over the world of countries that have lost millions upon millions of citizens' data. It's now floating around the internet. When you combine that with the massive benefit of collapsing the United States economy very specifically, it is an insane honey trap that they're setting up.
Since we already have you on the mic, Peter, maybe it can help the audience a little bit better to understand, because like the current financial system already allows for a lot of abuses, right? And there's already a lot of privacy issues. But can you maybe explain for the audience how central bank digital currencies fundamentally differ from the current digital, which is a mostly digital banking system?
Right, it is a digital banking system, but you can still opt out of it in a lot of ways. The most dramatic way that you can opt out of it is by simply using cash. So there are people who still run around and will only use cash so that they can't be tracked. You at least have that option. When it came to the Canadian truckers, for example, they were still able to buy lunch because they had cash. And by the way, there was a whole network of Bitcoiners who went to Ottawa and helped. A lot of the truckers didn't know how to use Bitcoin, and so they helped them get online, they helped them receive donations that way. But having some sort of money that is outside of the system is a safety valve. In normal times, like in the US, most of us don't really think of that as an important option, okay? But if you're in a country like Argentina, for example, Argentina before Milei, that was a life or death situation. It is possible that in this country it could become a life or death situation. For the Canadian truckers, of course, in that moment, it was a life and death situation. So it's extremely important to have that option, to have that out. Then you have a lot of ancillary businesses that are set up that, because they're based on cash, right? Cash is their nexus. They don't necessarily get automatically wrapped into that banking secrecy world. So you could have payment services like Zelle. Now, a lot of them are US based, and so they end up getting trapped. But again, if we get to a situation where the government is getting outrageously oppressive, then people would start using overseas services. We saw that, for instance, during the censorship, that people were starting to use overseas services, things like Telegram. So it's really that option, that out. That is what's closed off once you have a CBDC, because what will end up happening is that when they start out, they'll just pitch it as a convenience, lower cost, quicker transactions, wouldn't you love this? What they'll then do is they'll progressively squeeze out cash. So to give you a concrete example, today, if your restaurant or your store, okay, if your receipts, if a too high proportion of those are cash, then the IRS considers that suspicious and they'll audit you, okay? So if you're a restaurant, you are going to have a bias towards only accepting credit cards because you don't want an audit, right? That could wipe you out. Especially, I mean, the IRS has unlimited capacity to make audits more painful, right? So if you're gonna go in for a proctology exam every single year that could cost you $100,000, you're gonna say, screw it, we don't take cash, all right? So they have ways to squeeze that out. They are already doing it, and they don't have a CBDC. So once they do, they're going to pull out the drug dealing terrorists who tax, who dodge their tax. They're going to pull out the whole cast, they're going to put them up on stage, and they're going to say, this is why we have to go after cash even harder. They're going to squeeze it out. By the time you're done with it, if you are running around with scraps of, I mean, it would be like trying to live today with gold coins. Right? If you try to go to 7-Eleven and spend a gold coin, they're going to look at you like you're insane, right? That is the kind of world that they're going to be creating.
I'll just add a quick point to what Peter was saying. I've noticed this in various countries around the world. Obviously, we have a very international audience here today, so you might have seen this in your home country. But what they're doing in some countries is what they'll do is they will just take away the high denomination cash notes and then over time let it inflate away, so such that the highest note available is a very small denomination note. Yep. So this happens in Lebanon, in Turkey, and various other countries. So that's another way that they will go after cash, by taking away the high denomination notes. And
one example Peter already has given with the $10,000. When they implemented that, like if you had it in today's dollars, it would be probably like 70, 80K. Yep. And like now it's just 10K because it has been inflated away. So excellent points here. So for you, Robert, how do you think might CBDCs alter the relationship between citizens and the state? You as a philosopher probably have thought about this very deeply. What do you think?
Yeah, so, I mean, I try to distinguish between the government and the state. We use them a lot synonymously, but to try and break them apart a little bit. I think there's an argument to be made that we need some form of governance protection to preserve life, liberty, and property. And then just beyond that, let the market process do everything else. And I think that, as we mentioned earlier, CBDCs are like this ultimate instrument for violating private property, right? They destroy privacy, make it very easy to confiscate your wealth when it's stored in money. And so I think CBDCs sort of move us away, and you could say this about fiat currency in general, it moves us away from the constitutional republic that the United States was founded upon, this idea of decentralized governance, and it starts to push us closer and closer towards centralized governance. So away from localized government towards centralized statism. And so that is extremely problematic in how the individual relates to the state, because it's giving the state more and more power. Maybe the most useful way to think about centralized statism is that it is essentially a tax farm, right? Like you are all the crop. You go, you perform labor and you trade and you create things of value, and then the state comes in and says, yeah, you owe us a percentage of that. Very much like the mafia guy going door to door demanding protection money, and then you might ask yourself, well, protection from what? And the answer is protection from what the state will otherwise do to you if you don't pay the tax. So you don't want to empower that Leviathan, and I think CBDCs radically empower it. Another way to think about this, there's the book James C. Scott wrote, Seeing Like a State. And he talked a lot about the process of statism as trying to increase the legibility of taxpayers. So they want to know who you are, where you live, who you associate with, what are you worth, what's your income. There's a reason the IRS makes you issue a 1099 for every person that you send more than $600 in the US. Like they're trying to develop this web of interactions between taxpayers. So they have a map, right? They're trying to map taxpayer economic activities and interconnections so they can tax all of that shit. And CBDCs are just like the digital version of that, right? It's upgrading this surveillance apparatus into the digital age and makes us much more legible to the all-seeing eye of the state, which again makes taxpayers more exploitable. If you're looking at statism as a business, it's lowering the number of enforcement points, whereas right now they have to go into the commercial banking system, conduct audits, look at books and records, et cetera, et cetera. They can suck a lot of that in and just algorithmically analyze it. So you're lowering enforcement points, therefore you're lowering enforcement cost on the extortion of taxpayers, basically. So you're making statism more profitable and therefore larger and more intervening into our lives. So again, what's the solution? It's like you have to take energy out of that system. Like if you're holding savings in fiat currency, then you're actually empowering the state to grow through the counterfeiting of currency via the central bank. So if you pull savings out of that system, then you're debilitating their capacity to fund themselves via inflation. So short answer would be CBDCs radically tilt the scales of leverage in favor of the state and pulling your savings out of fiat currency and not complying, frankly, with CBDC. Just don't comply with this shit. right? They're going to bait you in with UBI. They're probably going to engineer some financial crisis, then say CBDCs are the answer. It was Bitcoin's fault. And now if you want your UBI, well, then you got to go sign up for your CBDC account. You'll get 8% a year or whatever it is. It's all bullshit. Just don't buy it.
Yeah.
Educate, hold your savings in Bitcoin, and do not comply.
Yeah, and so we all tend to agree here on stage. I mean, I couldn't find folks that were advocating for CBDCs, but I'm sure that there will be many out there quite soon, some mouthpieces that will advocate for that. But as you know, Frédéric Bastiat has said that the worst thing that can happen to a good cause is not to be skillfully attacked, but to be ineptly defended. So what would you say right now, what are some of the strongest arguments that we will hear quite soon about CBDCs and why we actually need them and why the old system is bad? Let's start with you, Stefan.
So one angle, obviously I agree with Peter's points around the money laundering angle, these other angles. Another angle that I think is going to be pushed and is being pushed on now is the climate scam angle, right? So they're doing this even in the EU, that they're trying to sort of attack the underlying proof of work that keeps Bitcoin secure and actually makes it a viable decentralized system. And they're going to try to undermine that and say, oh, you're not allowed to invest in that. Oh, that's a bad, the ECB doesn't like that. You better not use proof of work. You better use this nice little CBDC. It's very, quote unquote, efficient. Therefore, we don't have to worry about the climate, etc. So I think that is going to be a big angle, but it's hard to predict, right? Because ultimately, fear is what they can use to sort of motivate and to make the population willing to accept whatever, right? Oh, there's a big pandemic. You better all lock down. Oh, there's this other big thing. Everyone be scared now and let us take this new control. As Robert Higgs spoke about, this ratchet effect, that as a new crisis comes, the statism ratchets up, and then once the crisis is over, maybe it comes down a little bit, but they've still got that infrastructure now, right? There once was a time when we didn't even have to use passports, and now passports are a reality for anyone who wants to travel internationally.
There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government solution.
Yep. It's always good to quote Friedman, especially at a classical liberal conference. I like that. Peter, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. When the weather is good, they're going to push the efficiency and speed argument. That's what they're doing right now. But they are trying very hard, I think, to push a new crisis, whether that's a banking crisis, as Robert mentioned. That's kind of the most logical, that if the banks are collapsing, then people are going to ask for a CBDC. They're going to want, daddy to come in and fix it all. And of course, daddy caused the problem, right? All of these problems come from government in the first place, but this is kind of how they work. And, I think that we're in a very dangerous space right now because of what happened in COVID. So if you look back in American history, in World War I, we had a gang of totalitarians who took over the nation, and they imposed really a communist form of government. And they were booted out as soon as the war was over in 1918, but those guys stuck around. And they were led by the Commerce Secretary at the time, who was named Herbert Hoover. Okay, and he stuck around, and he missed those days of being a God emperor, and all those guys that just sat there and dreamed of those days when God strode the earth, these totalitarians. And they lay in wait like cicadas, and bam, when the Fed caused the next banking crisis, they were there. And in fact, Herbert Hoover by then was the president. And they all walked right in. By that point, they were bipartisan. Okay, it was both parties, the Hoover-FDR blend of policies, which were almost identical. I think after COVID, we're in that exact spot. We have taken a bunch of relatively tame animals, and they have tasted human flesh at this point. All right, and yes, they've pulled back from the totalitarian world that we had just a couple years ago, but they got a taste for it, and they're absolutely coming back. And CBDCs, I think, is going to be one of their biggest tools.
Not mincing words here. Very good. So what country do you think right now is the furthest ahead with CBDCs? Because we have seen a CBDC already been implemented in Nigeria. It flopped horribly. They really tried to incentivize people to use it, and nobody ended up using it. And it didn't work. What would you say are like some of the countries where they take it the most seriously, and it's like really a threat to liberty already now or soon to be?
Yeah, if I could add one thing to the last point, and then I'll answer that question. So the other thing I think with the implementation of CBDCs and the phasing out of physical cash, they seem to be pretty clued in that people are resistant to the idea of not having physical cash. I mean, you see Lagarde on TV saying, oh, you get to keep your physical cash, don't worry, we're just going to roll out the CBDC as another option. So they know that there's that's a point of public resistance, let's say. But I think in the wake of whatever financial crisis will be engineered to be the excuse for introducing this thing, they'll also introduce some type of graduated window, like maybe they'll say, you can turn in your physical cash for 110% of its value in CBDCs, and it's declining over time. So giving people this incentive to like rush in and exchange the cash voluntarily. Because at the end of the day, all of this stuff is funny money, so it doesn't really matter, right? They'll offer you 110% here, 8% yield, blah, 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 blah. They don't care because they're the currency issuer. So I would just say watch out for that too. And then, you're not safe. You're not safe with physical cash under a mattress like many people think. Sure, you get privacy gains, but you're not insulated from the inflation tax, right? You still get taxed via inflation no matter where you keep that physical currency. So I think it's important to get out now while you can before the doors to the theater start closing down as CBDCs roll out. To the question about who's furthest along, I would just go back to China on this again. I'm pretty sure they already have it implemented in some places. And then again, it feeds the social credit scoring system. So they do weird things already. If you say something online that the government doesn't like, they like put a picture of you on a billboard and shame you in your neighborhood. And then if you say something they do like, they'll put, they'll celebrate you. So it's just going to be that to the next level where they will start to deactivate your travel, et cetera, what you can eat, where you can go, what you can do. So as far as I know, and I'm not super studied on this topic, I would say China is the furthest along.
Stefan?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think China seems the most ahead. I think theirs is called the M Bridge, and they've even started some trials of international transfers into the Chinese CBDC system as well. So they seem the furthest ahead. There is an interesting CBDC tracker by the folks over at HRF. So for anyone interested, you can sort of get a global picture on what's most advanced in the CBDC world.
Yeah, that's the Human Rights Foundation. They have a CBDC tracker, so you can study them a little bit more closely. And it's already in place what you were saying, that if you have too low of a credit score, they prevent you from traveling. Mm-hmm. You cannot buy like a train ticket anymore. You cannot buy a plane ticket anymore. You're just confined to what your environment is. And so if that's not dystopian, then I don't know what is. So clearly you're all skeptical about this. What do you think can prevent this coming about? Because most of these things could probably come into place without any action of the population. It doesn't have to be, voted in necessarily. Maybe Congress or the Senate will vote on it, but maybe it can be done by an executive decree. So the Fed was not particularly created democratically, or they did that just when everybody was on vacation. And neither does the CBDC in many countries. So what do you think can prevent them from coming about? Is there anything that can be done?
I think the absolute most important is they're relying on a sense of inevitability. Okay, so they want us to give up hope. They want us to say, to create so many layers of it, right? You've got the UN treaties and then the EU, if you happen to be, unfortunately, in that outfit, and you've got the national and the state, and you've got, they just try and put so many layers on it so that you feel like it's just inevitable, that you can't change it. But the thing is, you want to step out from that. Any country that has had a credible survey, like a public opinion survey on CBDCs, they've had 90% opposition. All right, that was Austria, that was the US. Okay, there have been a number of countries where there's been surveyed. Overwhelmingly, nobody wants this. If that doesn't make sense to you, if you're an American, ask yourself, what would a survey look like that said, should we get rid of the penny? Okay, overwhelmingly, people just don't touch my penny, okay? People do not want to lose their money. It's very, very easy to make people understand exactly what a CBDC is, right? You would wipe out all your money, and the government will get to decide what your bank account is, all right? Nobody wants that, unless you're being paid a salary by some organization that, like Ripple. I'm gonna get attacked for that. Ripple, by the way, is the main promoter of CBDCs. There, I said it. At any rate, 90% of the population hates these things. We need to absolutely take advantage of that, all right? We need to organize, communicate with your politicians. Politicians will do the darndest things in the dark, all right? And if people are calling them out for it, if they're calling them out openly, then there are a whole lot of them who will pull back because politicians have no spine. Everybody says, oh, it's so sad, they have no spine. Okay, they have no spine, that means they're weak. They're easy to influence. They will not stand up to you. They will cower off. They will scamper off into the darkness. So you have to rely on that. Everybody, when you walk down the street, everybody you see agrees with you. CBDCs are horrific. Work with that.
Yeah, and we should. And typically, now, PhD often is not very useful, but I've studied lawmaking during crises. And so you're absolutely right. Robert Hicks was correct. So each time when there's a crisis, politicians generally don't regulate financial markets all that much. Yep. But they do once crises happen. But it really shows that during those times, much more laws get enacted in a much quicker time. And they're very lengthy and have a lot of regulation there. And it could be that something horrific happens and people are suffering. And they say, like, we just need to save everyone. But we need to be vigilant about this and really inform ourselves and others. And if you think, like, hey, this might not pertain to you, maybe think again. Right? We never thought it would happen in Canada. But also, I know so many human rights activists, anyone that fights for the rights of people, stands up for them, who get targeted, first and foremost, financially. Because once you take the money away from them, you basically have them crippled. Yep. And that is really a sad thing, and it can happen to all of us since we are fighting for human rights. We are fighting for property rights, for small government, and so it can happen to all of us, and we have seen this all around the world. We are paying at Students for Liberty over 20 of our staff members in Bitcoin because the financial system is so screwed in many of these countries that we don't pay them otherwise. And so there's opportunities there, and it's good that you're here and that you're listening to that, but don't be fooled that it might not happen to you at some point.
Something I'll add here, perhaps a bit of a silver lining. Many of you have seen the financial cancellation of Nigel Farage recently. And that also spurred a lot more people within the UK being aware of this issue of debanking. And so it's sort of similar in that sense. And I'll share another interesting statistic I found recently, which is that in Australia, we all know there's been this war on cash, right? Funnily enough, in Australia, there's actually more cash being held by the individuals. And you know why? It's that a lot of people are holding these $50 and $100 notes. So they are, I guess the answer it seems to be that they are doing the proverbial cash under the mattress. So there's some level of resistance amongst the population, but I think it's about turning that into the right direction, which is to understand that holding fiat cash under the mattress is not a long-term answer. At best, you can maybe stave it off a little bit further, but the long-term answer, everything is going to get digitized, and it's probably in our lifetimes. And so you have to make that choice, and we have to help educate those of us who are not here. Which kind of money? Do you want the freedom digital money, or do you want the panopticon digital money? Because it's one or the other. You're going to have to choose.
I think it's well said, and to Wolf's point, to think that it's not going to happen to you is just ignorance, right? Open a history book. Like once these tools come out, what's the old saying? You might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Like it's coming, so you have to resist. And I think educating people that it's the way you save and spend your money is the most important vote that you cast. So even those people that are stashing cash under the mattress, like that is an act of resistance, but I don't think it's the right act of resistance because you're still creating reservation demand for the currency that's being counterfeited to impose the CBDC and all the other tyrannical bullshit. You've got to study the nature of money, study Bitcoin, and learn about exiting the system. When you save in Bitcoin, you're basically undermining a system, all the fiat-funded activities, mainstream media propaganda, the mass murder campaigns we call war, and the implementation of CBDCs. You're undermining their ability to do all of that just by moving your savings out of fiat currency. And so what else can you do beyond that? You can educate people, right? You can create digital content, distribute it on social media, you can write, you can podcast, like the cost of bandwidth is now zero, your reach can be global for little to no cost. It's important that we leverage these technologies that are available to us to spread the truth and hopefully create an ideological resistance to this machine. So
we are soon finishing up here, but it seems like all of you, I might have picked up on that you're a fan of Bitcoin. About like the nature of money or Bitcoin or informing ourselves about the importance of these things, what kind of recommendation, what like book or so would you recommend? Maybe we start with you, Robert, and then all of you, so that the audience has something to take away.
Yeah, I would read Honest Money by Gary North. The Creature from Jekyll Island, and Atlas Shrugged.
All right, very good, Peter.
Seyfedin Ammous's 2 books, Bitcoin Standard, Fiat Standard is probably where I'd start. He is an Austrian economist, as I think all of us are.
I guess so at this point.
Yeah, I mean, those are all great books. I will make another recommendation. It's called The Ethics of Money Production by Guido Hulsmann. Fantastic book and really solidifies a lot of things around fiat money and the state.
Please help me thank the panel here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.